Good morning, everybody. So I don't know if they've told you yet. We need to stay close to, we don't have to be at, but close to the mic.
Perfect.
Okay? We'll walk through, today we're doing CUI Comply or Die. The session agenda is first a quick disclaimer, and then a little bit about us, a little bit about the CUI program, some CUI case studies. So the fun part is, as you'll see in a second, I'm a former professor. I'm Jim Goepel. I'm a former professor. I get to stand in front and talk about all the conceptual things, and then Jake is going to actually talk about them in the real world, which is going to be kind of cool. So, and then we'll get to a Q&A. We love questions, so please don't hesitate to ask any questions that you might have. I am a lawyer, so of course I have to issue the stereotypical disclaimer. None of this represents legal advice. There are lots of subtleties, so we're going to try to simplify things. But of course, anytime you simplify things, it just you abstract it out. You leave out certain details. So make sure you talk to somebody about your specific scenarios. Don't just rely on what we tell you here today. So a little bit about us. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Jim, appreciate that. And I will say my favorite part of this is Jim does all of the educating, and I just get to tell war stories. So when he approached me about doing this together, I said, this sounds like my favorite kind of speech. I'm Jake Nix, founder, CEO of RiskPoint. Spent a fair amount of time in the Big Four world, EY, PwC. About 7 years ago, founded RiskPoint, and we specialize in advisory in CMMC, FedRAMP, High Trust, ISO, SOC, pretty much every alphabet soup that exists in the compliance world. And looking forward to sharing some real world experience with you today.
And I'm Jim Goepel. I am the Director of Education at FutureFeed. We make a GRC platform to help you get CMMC ready. I am also a founding member of the Cyber AB. I was there before it started. That's actually what got me into the topic of controlled and classified information. I'm a former systems administrator for Congress. I've done all sorts of weird things in my career. I'm also a lawyer and a professor, like I said. And the thing that really got me was, as I was on the AB, I kept hearing about this thing called controlled and classified information. I had been a lawyer for government contractors for years, never had heard about it. And so I started digging into it and tried to understand more about it because I kept hearing conflicting information. I wound up actually writing 2 books about it just to try to make things a little bit easier for everybody else. There's a big, thick book that we don't have at our booth, but if you stop by the booth, we have a little book called CUI Fundamentals, and it's helpful for those that are just trying to get a basic understanding for what CUI is, and much of it will be the stuff that we talk about today. So the story of CUI actually goes back a long time. Believe it or not, it goes even before the 9/11 attacks, but the 9/11 Commission found that there were a lot of inconsistencies in the way the agencies handled sensitive information, and those issues and those inconsistencies actually led to the 9/11 attacks. The agencies had the information they needed to protect our nation, but they weren't sharing it. Even unclassified information, they weren't sharing it. So the 9/11 Commission said, government, we need to do a better job of this. Congress heard that, the president heard that, and they started trying to figure out what can we do better. So the 9/11 Commission found that a lot of agencies, like I said, were not willing to share information, and part of that was that there were a lot of different types of sensitive information. The government, as I said, the government recognized that it needed to find a more standardized approach to the identification and dissemination of that sensitive but unclassified information specifically. And it has to be consistent across the entire federal government. It has to recognize that unclassified information is unclassified. We need to get away from that need-to-know concept that you hear about with classified information. We need to actually encourage the free flow of information across the government because we don't want another 9/11 attack. So the result was an overhaul of the sensitive information program. Actually, back in 2003, there was an executive order that first overhauled how classified information was handled. Then back in 2008, they started looking at the sensitive unclassified information, and there was an early attempt during the Bush administration to create a new standardized program. And I'm not trying to interject politics in this. One of the things that I hear a lot is, oh, this stuff is going to go away. This stuff goes back to the Bush administration. The Obama administration came in and actually doubled down on all of this stuff. And then the Trump administration came in and doubled down again. And then the Biden administration took a strategic pause for CMMC, but they actually also doubled down on all of this. So this is not something that's going away. It's something that is deeply entrenched in the government at this point. So anyway, to jump back to the story, in 2010, again, the Obama administration further refines the classified information program, and they formally established this thing called controlled unclassified information. And this was one of my favorite quotes from the executive order that created the classified information program, actually, is our democratic principles require that American people be informed of the activities of their government. Also, our nation's progress depends on the free flow of information both within the government and to the American people. Fundamentally, we are restructuring the information programs, the way the government creates and handles information. So this is a really big deal, and the reason that you're going to hear me keep harping on it is that many of the agencies have been using these old, what they call legacy markings literally for decades. It is part of who they are as an agency. And it has been really hard for them to get past this. But that mindset needs to shift, and you're starting in the last year. I've started to see DoD actually starting to take more interest in changing that mindset. It's been wonderful to see. So back in the day, you had about 100 different legacy markings just for unclassified information, things like SBU, LES, CII, and many, many others. And this is what the 9/11 Commission said is just dead wrong. We can't do this. We need to find a way to standardize everything. They wanted, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, that one ring to rule them all, and that becomes the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, is actually the agency that manages the CUI program. So this came from the president. The Office of the President said, we need to create this, and they said, NARA, you're the one who's going to actually be in charge of making all of this work. One of the first things that NARA said is, okay, we're going to standardize the definition for controlled unclassified information. We'll talk about that definition in just a moment. But legacy information, all of that stuff that had markings on it before, doesn't count. You have to actually reevaluate it all. So inherently, FOUO, SBU, LES, all those other legacy markings, they don't count as CUI. They do not automatically become CUI. The agency has to review all of that information. So agencies and authorized holders must discontinue use of all legacy markings not permitted by this part or included in the CUI registry. If the markings remain on information, the legacy markings are void and no longer indicate the information is protected or that it qualifies as CUI. So why are agencies still using some of these old legacy markings? As I said, it's hard to get people to change, but we're starting to see some of that change. The agencies are actually supposed to go back and review that information, and really important, the language in 32 CFR 2002, the CUI program, specifically says that the agencies must review the documents created prior to that 2016 date and remark the stuff as CUI. Now, they do a horrible job of that. That's a completely separate issue. But it is the agency's job. It is not your job as a contractor. Anybody here not a government contractor? Anybody with the government? Okay, so I've got one. So the other, the agencies are supposed to be the ones doing this, not you as the contractor. It is really important. You do not have the authority to make that determination, because what they've said, if you go back to that previous slide where they talked about how it's the free flow of information is so important, right? You as the contractor, when you mark something as CUI, you are impeding the flow of that information. That is an inherently governmental act. You are not authorized to make that determination. But what you should do, go back to the government. If you see something that looks and smells like CUI, you go back to the government and you ask, hey, should this be marked? That's perfectly fine. The one thing that I would encourage you to do, and I'll probably beat this to death a couple more times, but the one thing I would encourage you to do is when you ask, don't just say, hey, is this CUI? Ask them, hey, is this CUI? And if so, which law, regulation, or government-wide policy are you using as the basis for that CUI designation? Because 9 times out of 10, the answer will be, oh, never mind, it's not CUI. If you ask that second part. If you only say, is this CUI, you're going to get the answer yes. But when you ask them to actually back it up, that's when you're going to get them to go, no, it's not.
So when you make it harder, they actually have to do their job? And
When they actually have to do their job, yes, they actually have to do their job.
And then they go find out, oh, there's nothing actually regulating this data.
Yes.
Actually, I don't need to cover my butt. You're fine.
Or I can't cover my rear end. And so that was one of the things that the 9/11 Commission found, was that they were slapping FOUO, SBU, and other legacy
everything.
markings on everything. There were, you can search online, some of my prior presentations, I have some of them. They have things like menus that were marked, literally a publicly available menu was marked as FOUO. Orders that were placed, food orders that were placed, and not for like a really sensitive meeting or anything like that, just a random food order had FOUO marked on it. So government was way over marking, and so that's part of that re-education program, is now going back and saying, hey, what's the law, regulation, or government policy that is the basis for this?
Yeah, there's a little, not to interject, but there's a little story that's really interesting. We had a customer 3 or 4 years ago that their agency sponsor was FEMA's subset organization, FIMA, and their ISO was telling us, hey, you have to write your system security plan for this FISMA authorization in accordance with our template. I was like, great, send me the template. He's like, oh, it's for official use only. I can't send it outside of government furnished equipment. I was like, okay, can you give me like a general idea of what we need to do? We're doing a FedRAMP control baseline. Can we just use the FedRAMP moderate template from FedRAMP? No, it has to be the FIMA template, but I can't give it to you because it's for official use only. I finally got my government furnished equipment, and it was the FedRAMP template with a few FIMA markings on it and a couple of distinguishments, and it was basically publicly available information.
Yeah.
And that was 2019, so it's still pervasive.
Yes, and especially, so DOD has done, to their credit, so you're going to hear me knock DOD quite a bit on some of the markings and recognition of this stuff. Yeah. To their credit, they are actually trying. So they were the first. In 2016, when the CUI program came out, they were one of the first agencies to say, we're going to embrace this and we are going to create our own CUI program. Was it perfect? No, definitely not. But they've made improvements over time, and it is getting better. There's still room for improvement, but they have done a wonderful job, and they are much further ahead. One of the largest agencies in the government is embracing this fundamental change in the way that they think. And when you have 4 million employees just in DoD, it can take a while to change minds. So again, I do want to be fair, because you will hear me knock on them quite a bit, but I do want to be fair. They are trying, and they are doing a decent job of trying. So. When it comes to CUI, so you were talking a minute ago about how you need to justify what law, regulation, or government-wide policy that comes from, and that fundamental question is not a bad thing to ask. In fact, it's part of the definition for CUI. So there is a very long definition for it. The oversimplification of it is CUI is unclassified information created or received for or on behalf of the U.S. government that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy. And I usually use the LRGWIP acronym because it's easy to pronounce, says can or must be safeguarded or is subject to limited dissemination controls. So as long as there is a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that says the information is supposed to be protected or that it can be subject to limited dissemination controls, that's it. That's what makes it CUI. Everybody wants to make it this big, scary thing. The definition isn't that bad. It's just as long as it's the government's information and as long as there's a law that says, I'm going to oversimplify it and call it a law, as long as there's a law that says that it has to be protected, you're done. That makes it CUI. Now, the other thing you'll hear, and this was one that really threw me for a while when I first started in this area, was the concept of CUI basic and CUI specified. And I kept hearing people talk about specified. I would ask them, what does specified mean? And nobody could answer me. So that was an interesting area to research. So CUI specified means that the law, regulation, or government-wide policy that makes the information CUI specifies how to protect it. Period. That's it. That's all it is. That's what makes it, the magic is that it specifies how to protect it. CUI basic is the law doesn't say how to protect it. Most legislators are lazy. They understand that they are, I'll spin it a different way. They recognize that they are not subject matter experts, and so they don't want to tell you how to protect the information. They're just going to tell you that it needs to be protected, and it's up to you to figure out how, which is great when you're the government and you have all the resources to be able to define how you're supposed to protect things. That's wonderful. But when it comes to most of us outside of the government, we don't have the resources to do a risk analysis and do all the other stuff that you would want to do in order to figure that out. So, but that's the goal with writing that CUI basic, is that they're trying to make it easier for themselves. They're trying to give agencies and even us more flexibility in how we approach things. So what the National Archives said when the CUI program was first assigned to them, they were like, okay, so we have all these laws that say we're supposed to protect it, but they don't tell us how. And they said, okay, NIST, we want you to define a baseline for how to protect this. What's really interesting, that's where NIST Special Publication 800-171 comes in. And if you're a NIST fan like me, you're familiar with the RMF, you're probably familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, you're probably familiar with many of the other frameworks that are out there. And even if you're an ISO or other, if you play in other realms, one of the big things that is different about 800-171 is that the government looked at, when I'm going to give sensitive information to Jake, what do I expect him to do? That is, they did their own risk analysis and said, if we're going to hand this to you, how do I expect you to protect this stuff? That is fundamentally different from the RMF, the CSF, from ISO, because in those cases, you are conducting the risk assessment, or Jake would be, in my scenario, Jake would be conducting the risk assessment, but Jake has no idea how sensitive my information is, especially for me. Even though I tell him, dude, don't give this out, I don't trust him. He is going to give that information out.
For the right price.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to make sure, and the government said, okay, we need to make sure that this information is properly protected. So they did a risk analysis. They watered everything down and really, believe it or not, despite what 800-171 looks like, they simplified things quite a bit. They said, this is how you should be protecting the information. So they made your life, believe it or not, a whole lot easier. They've actually established a wonderful baseline for any sensitive information, even outside of the government. As you're exchanging that information, what should you be doing at a minimum to handle that sensitive information? So fundamentally, they said, this is the way that the information needs to be protected. And it is the baseline for all sensitive information. That means, by definition for government contractors, information is only CUI if it's created by the contractor during the performance of a contract or received by the contractor from the government or a higher tier contractor during the performance of a contract. So that definition, right, we're talking about the definition of CUI. If you are dealing with information, the only time as a contractor that it is CUI is if it's created by you under a contract, if it's received by you under the contract, and a law, regulation, or government-wide policy says that it has to be protected, and a federal agency has made that designation. So just because I'm a government contractor, I'm a software developer, just because I'm developing software for the government does not mean that it is inherently CUI. An agency has to make that determination. It is not my job to make that determination. Now, again, as a responsible citizen, should I be going back and asking the government, you know, it looks like in the past I've done contracts and they've said it was CUI and this is why. Should I go back to the government and ask, you know, this looks like it should be too? Yes, absolutely. I always want to err on the side of asking, but it is not my job and not my role to make that determination. Again, I don't even have the authority to do it. Can a contractor designate information as CUI? Again, the answer is no. And I will keep beating this because it's important. CUI designation impedes the free flow of information. This makes it an inherently governmental act. The designating agency has to make that determination, not you. And only laws, regulations, and government-wide policies approved by NARA can be the basis for a CUI designation. There are 400 laws, regulations, and government-wide policies listed on the National Archives and Records Administration's CUI registry. How many of you want to read every law, regulation, and government-wide policy and take on the responsibility of making that determination for the government? Yeah, I didn't think so. So NARA publishes those at the CUI registry. Talk a little bit about some case studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jim, I gotta say, so there's three pieces not related to the case study that I have to touch on. First, if my contracting officers could attend this session, my life would be a lot easier as somebody that helps folks set up CUI environments. The other piece that I'd say that's really interesting to take away from this conference, and if you learn anything from me today, it's the nuance of CMMC is not the control set. The control set, to Jim's point, very straightforward. One of the most simple ways to implement cybersecurity. You have your controls, go implement them. It's not like RMF where you have to do a risk assessment. There is no control tailoring. It is very straightforward. The difficult part of CMMC that people are not talking about nearly enough is it is one of the only undefined scope certifications in cybersecurity. SOC 2, you define your scope. FedRAMP is a defined scope. ISO is a defined scope. You have to find your CUI, designate where you're going to keep it, and protect that environment. That's why this is the area that you hear a lot about enclaves and things of that nature, because it's sometimes a lot easier to start at good than it is to go find and create everything else as good. So I'll talk a little bit more about that during the second case study, but I think one of the interesting things, and again, to Jim's credit, if more folks knew the nuances of how to work with the government, we probably wouldn't have nearly the portfolio that we do. But we did have a really interesting client situation where they got a contract through US Transcom. They had this great legacy commercial app. The core team was not at all familiar with compliance whatsoever, let alone government compliance. And they had a very complex legal structure. It was through a joint venture that went up all the way to US Transcom. The contract was reported on in Congress. It was pretty well visible, and everybody was kind of trying to cover their butt kind of thing. And of course, the code did not function in a hardened environment. And the fact of the matter was the DoD was a little bit scared, and the prime contractor was a little bit scared of what this application would do. And so when we first got in there, what we were told is that we're going to actually have to comply with DoD DISA IL4. Now, this was an app that was made to move and coordinate the move of U.S. military personnel in the United States when they were moving from base to base. So we're not talking about military actions. We're not talking about things that would actually qualify for DoD impact level 4. There was no national security threat. But at the end of the day, the contract itself, because it was written by folks that had not attended one of Jim's speeches, actually did say that it had to be built on a DoD IL4 environment. Now, fun fact, it was just the proposal being copied over into the contract, and the proposal itself said, we're going to build an AWS GovCloud, and that's DoD IL4. So we ended up overbuilding the environment, but focused on CMMC and 800.171. We went through the process of petitioning our prime contractor to talk to our DoD mission owner. It took about 7 months to get clarity. And so in these 7 months, we're running up, we're building, we're spending a lot of money to get to IL4, but we're trying to do it conservatively. The customer's like, hey, I'm not getting paid to build an IL4 environment. I did not plan for this in my budget. And so what we tried to do is front load the 171 controls. And we had a lot of things on standby waiting for that eventual DISA assessment from a 3PAO and then the DISA authorization. We did finally get concurrence that it was actually, in fact, a CMMC requirement. Funny part is DFARS was not in the contract, just DoD IL4. And so it ended up having to go through a specific change order with the contracting officer. It was a giant mess in that perspective. But there's a lot of things that we learned from that. One is your compliance and security team needs to be involved in the bid, and needs to be involved in the proposal, and needs to be involved in the contract review. One of the things that our clients get wrong all the time is they do not interject any sort of CMMC expertise into the legal department. And when we come in and we look at an environment and we do our gap assessment or we determine if somebody's ready or complying, that's where we start. And a lot of times our customers look at us, we're often hired by CISOs and COOs, and they're like, why do you need to talk to our legal department? Or why would you need to talk to our external counsel? They cost a lot of money. And we say, well, we probably need to figure out whether or not you're in CMMC exposure. To Jim's point, you can't decide that something's CUI. It needs to come from somewhere. And right now it comes from contract flow downs and DFARS. And so if you think just because you're working in the defense industrial base that you are subject to CMMC or you know how to comply with CMMC, you don't, unless you're looking at your legal contracts first. And so one of the key takeaways from this case study, and there's a little bit more fun in the second one that we'll get into deeper technical nerdiness, but my big takeaway here is, one, you need to start at the contract, and two, if the contract doesn't make sense, you probably need to go to your mission owner or your contract officer with your business involved and say, guys, this does not make any actual sense. And the only reason we're able to eventually get to that CMMC determination and get things changed with the contract is because from day one, when we started the technical build out, we started it with an analysis of the contract. What is the data that we're going to be holding, storing, processing, transmitting on behalf of the US government, and what should be there to protect it? And because of that, we were able to eventually get that contract change. But at the end of the day, if you educate yourself through conversations with Jim, if you educate yourself on the topic, all of this is pretty easy to find yourself in a position of strength, but you have to have that baseline education. That's one of the reasons I'm excited to be part of this talk today, is because you got to start here, and hopefully the case studies will help tie it together.
And there are some things that you can do. So there are assumptions in many contracts. And taking the time to craft a couple assumptions, not to tout the books, but the big book has some assumptions in it. Yeah. One of the things that you can do is to very carefully say, look, we expect, because, and you can cite the actual laws and regulations, we expect that you will be properly identifying and designating CUI. You're going to tell us anything that we handle or we create, that whether it's CUI or not. And if you don't, that's a contract mod. Right, so if you come back to us later and say, oh, that was CUI, that's actually a modification, and now we're going to have to go back and do some renegotiations. We do have to make sure that we're going to actually get paid to handle things appropriately. So there's some really stupid, simple things that you can do to give yourselves a little more wiggle room, but to Jake's point, you have to be aware, right? And your legal team probably isn't paying attention to CMMC because it's cybersecurity and they don't really get involved in cyber. So, yeah.
And one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine is, yes, you want to be customer service focused. Yes, this is probably one of the biggest contracts that your company has. But you have to go back and say, hey, government, you've alerted me that we're going to have to protect CUI. What is it? What are you giving us that's CUI? Because controlled and unclassified information is anything but controlled right now. Half of it's not marked, half of it's assumptionative from the folks that you're working with. And to Jim's point, and to my anecdote earlier, half the folks in the government are still using terms like for official use only, and they're like, I don't know what CUI is. It's not very hard, but it is an uncomfortable conversation because they're going to shy away from telling you this is CUI unless you push them to do that. And it's even more difficult when it's the concept of creating or having derivative CUI in a contract. So having those discussions, while uncomfortable, very much worth the investment.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you give the government, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the derivative works in just a second too. So that's one of my favorite topics. So if you give the government your proprietary information, we talked a minute ago about like the fact that you don't have the authority to designate information on behalf of the government, but what about when you're giving the government your information? You want to always make sure that you mark it as proprietary before you give it to the government, because there are actually laws, regulations, and government policies that say that they have to protect information like that when it comes in, and it makes it CUI when they get it. So you can and should include a cover letter that tells them that, hey, when you get this, now that you should please be treating this as CUI. Again, you can't mark it as CUI before you give it to them, but you can give them a letter that says, hey, you should be, and here is why. Again, don't mark it as CUI, even though it should be once the government gets it, because you're not an agency and you're not authorized to do that. And also be careful, the word proprietary is really the one that you want to use. If you're not familiar with classified information, everybody thinks about secret and top secret. There's also a level below that called confidential. So the most confusing thing you can do is mark something as confidential and give it to the government. It will really mess things up. So how do I know when information that I receive is CUI? CUI must always be marked before it's disseminated to anyone. Dissemination is a fancy word for shared. They love to use that word instead. I don't know why. And it must be overtly marked as CUI, or its container will be marked as CUI. So if this information is on a CD-ROM, or in some cases, they can get away with an entire room slapping that big red label on the door and that says that everything in this room is controlled and classified information, because it very well may be. And so going through the process of marking every one of the documents that's in that room may be overly burdensome, so NARA allowed for some wiggle room. Or your contract will specify that as CUI. So to Jake's point before, you do need to read your contracts. Now, just because the DFAR 7012, 7019, 7020, 7021 clauses are in your contract does not mean that the information that you are handling is CUI. They are required contract clauses. They are required to be in most contracts. And so most contracting officers will put them in first, and then it's only after you talk to them and you negotiate with them that they might remove it if you're not actually handling CUI. So the fact that that clause is in there does not automatically mean that you are handling CUI. There's supposed to be additional language in there, or you start receiving documents that are marked as CUI. What about information I create? Only the agency that owns the information can designate it as CUI. So this is stuff where the government, again, like as I said before, the scenario where I'm a software developer or I'm doing some other analysis for the government, this stuff that I'm creating, I don't get to just decide on my own that it's CUI. The agency that owns it, that is the agency that you're contracting with, needs to decide that it is CUI. If they hire you to collect that agency, again, they should designate that the CUI designation to you. DoD has instructed its personnel, and many of them don't realize this because there are so many policies at DoD, it is so easy to miss stuff, and they are so long too that it's easy to miss stuff. But in DoDI 5200.48, that's DoD instruction 5200.48, section 3.7.e, DoD has told its personnel that the CUI designations are supposed to be communicated as part of a security classification guide. If you've never seen a security classification guide, what they tell you is very specific information and attributes about that information that make it sensitive. Most of the time it's that make it classified information, but in some cases, in this case, it's what makes it CUI. So you can see on the left-hand side, that is a screen capture, and you'll get the slides and you can zoom in. But that is a screen capture of what is now unclassified security classification guides. They usually are classified. But what DoD has said is even for your unclassified information, you're going to have to start creating these. Most folks at DoD do not know that they are supposed to be doing this. But what you'll notice is it's really hard to see, I recognize, especially from way at the back of the room, but what you'll notice is that the language here says this statement in excess of 50,000 feet is unclassified. But when you start getting into other attributes about it, the things that make this, in this case, an aircraft, what it does and how high it can fly and all that kind of stuff, that becomes, in this case, classified information. The same kind of information, the same kinds of attributes are what they should be communicating to you about the CUI that they are giving you. They're supposed to tell you this is what makes it CUI. In contracts to create information, you should always use that security classification guide to decide whether the stuff that you're creating is CUI or not, and when to mark it. If you receive information that's marked as CUI and you don't think it should be, ask for the security classification guide and that law, regulation, or government-wide policy. Again, usually that's when the agency will say, oh, never mind, we'll just take the CUI label off, and they do. And that's a good practice for really every piece of CUI. Now we get into the copies and derivative works piece. CUI is fundamentally about the protection of information. It's not about protecting a document. It's not about protecting a widget. It's about protecting the information that is embodied in that document or that widget. So when I make a copy of that information, it is a copy of that information. It is still the information. It still needs to be protected appropriately. Derivative works are where I'm taking a concept from that original document and I'm either taking an excerpt of it, I'm summarizing it, I'm doing something to that information. This is why that security classification guide is so important, because if you have that, then you know whether your summary or your excerpt contains the sensitive stuff and makes your summary or excerpt still CUI, or if you leave that stuff out, it's not CUI anymore. So it's really important that you go back and you ask the government. And if you can't get the security classification guide, if you can't get contract language, a memo, something that helps you understand what it is that makes it CUI, you're back to having to ask the contracting officer or ask the government all the time, does this look like CUI? Does this look like CUI? It is not the worst thing in the world, but to Jake's point, it can take a while to get an answer from the government, especially when it comes to CUI.
Yeah, one of the things that I see a lot, especially in today's data is power, reports are everything world, is a lot of our customers will be like, well, I need to put together this report. It's aggregation. It's not CUI, et cetera, et cetera. It's CUI. You're talking about data that's CUI at a higher level. It is getting more intelligent. It's more usable. It's more readable. Taking hard to understand CUI and making it easy to understand on the aggregate level is easier for our enemies to take and use against us. There's a little bit of common sense that's missing when it comes to derivative CUI.
Yeah, and now conversely, when you look at things like the landing gear for an aircraft that might have special attributes, right?
Yeah.
The conglomeration of all of that information makes it very sensitive, and we obviously want to protect it. But the specifications for, especially when it's a commercial part, the specification for a bolt is probably not on its own going to wind up being CUI. Now, again, not legal advice, and the devil's always in the details. I'll put in all the disclaimers. But that's the whole point, is you actually have some flexibility, and the agencies have some flexibility. So if you have a subcontractor who's going to be doing some work, and you don't need to give them the entire sensitive, the CUI piece, you can excerpt it out and give them the piece that's not CUI. They don't need to be 800, they don't need to be compliant with 800-171. They don't need to be CMMC level 2 certified. Your life gets a whole lot easier, but you have to have that dialogue back and forth with the government, or you get the security classification guide up front, make your life a whole lot easier.
Yep. We just lost like 3 bolt manufacturers. They're going to go and tell the folks that Jim said it's fine.
Exactly. So the converse question that we always get is, what about unmarked CUI? And if a contractor receives information that the contractor believes is CUI, but it is not marked as CUI, they are not authorized to designate it, but they must not mark it, but they must still treat it as though it is CUI. So if Jake is not an authorized holder, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, but he's not authorized to handle CUI, guess what? I can't give it to him until I get confirmation from the government that it is, whether or not it is CUI.
Yep.
And ask your prime contractor or the government if it is. That's the easiest solution to that problem. If the government doesn't know, then 32 CFR 2002 says it's not CUI, period. So they are supposed to not mark it as CUI. They're not supposed to designate it. But again, the government, need to make that designation, not you. Do you want to add anything before I keep rambling? Okay, sorry.
No,
A note about distribution statements as well. So if you go back and read that definition for CUI, you'll notice it said law, regulation, and government policy says it must be protected or is subject to limited dissemination controls. DOD uses very specific limited dissemination controls. They use this thing under this other DOD instruction. It's 5230.24 that tells their program managers when and how to use these limited dissemination controls. They call them distribution statements. And they actually allow, and so this is one of the weird scenarios where it's usually the OCAs, the original classification authorities, who make the determination whether information is CUI or not. But in this one case, they've actually designated and delegated authority down to program managers and said, you can actually apply a distribution statement and make information CUI just because we recognize that you think that this stuff is sensitive, and so we're going to allow you to do that. So you will see those distribution statements. Now, not all distribution statements make information CUI. There are distribution statements A through F. B through F make it information CUI. Distribution statement A actually says that it's public. So always ask your program manager if you see a limited distribution statement, and that's kind of what they look like. Down in the footer, you can see what the different components mean. If you see a limited distribution statement, you should go back and ask your contracting officer for the corresponding law, regulation, and government-wide policy, and for the appropriate markings, because that is CUI, even though it may not have CUI on the header. So I mentioned a second ago that concept of authorized holders, and you're only allowed to disseminate information to authorized holders, only allowed to disseminate CUI to authorized holders. That includes being permitted to access systems which can handle CUI or locations where CUI is handled. That means that your cleaning crew is probably not authorized to be in a room where CUI is sitting out in the open. To be an authorized holder, a person must have a lawful government purpose to access that information. Lawful government purpose is defined as an activity, mission, function, operation, or endeavor that the U.S. government authorizes or recognizes within the scope of its legal authorities or the legal authorities of non-executive branch entities. Lots of words. Basically, it means that if you're helping to push forward the purposes of the contract, then you probably have a lawful government purpose for handling that information. So if somebody needs access to the information to help further the purposes of the contract again, then they probably have a lawful government purpose for it. What that means, again, to go back to the cleaning crew can't go into the room if CUI is sitting out on the desk. That's a problem. So what do? You have a clean desk policy. You put the stuff in a drawer, you lock the drawers, and you have somebody who walks the floor at night before the cleaning crew gets there and makes sure that all the CUI is put away. It's not that hard. There are things that you can do to allow your business to continue. You just have to be very thoughtful about how you work things. And I'm a lawyer. Back in the day when I worked for my law firm, there were times when I had stuff and I was not going to clear up my desk every night because there was just, papers were everywhere. They were organized in a certain way, and I was not going to try to remake all that organization. So what I would do is, that was the night that the cleaning crew did not come into my office. I would close the door behind me. I would bring the trash can out in the hallway, close the door behind me and lock it, and the cleaning crew did not have a key to my office. It was that simple. So there are easy things that you can do to deal with these scenarios, but you have to be very cautious and conscious of these issues. Make sure that you're handling them right. The converse to this is, think about your systems administrators. Systems administrators are there helping you keep things up and running. Do they have a lawful government purpose to handle that information? I think you could make an argument that the answer is yes. Whether you would win, I can't tell you for sure, but I think you could make an argument that they are doing that, again, as opposed to a cleaning crew who really has no purpose in handling that information.
They're necessary to do your job.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Under 32 CFR 2002, only an authorized holder can disseminate CUI to, and can receive, and they are only authorized to disseminate CUI to someone else, provided the intended recipient is an authorized holder and the disseminator has a reasonable belief that the intended recipient can properly handle CUI. So I can't just get CUI, say, oh, Jake is really awesome and I want to use him on my contract, and then I can give it to him. No, I've got to make sure, I actually have to ask him, are you able to handle CUI, and are you going to protect it properly? And Jake, of course, is going to say yes. But that's a whole separate issue. We'll cover that in a second. How do you prove reasonable belief? You can ask lots of questions. I can say, hey, Jake, so tell me a little bit more about your program, and which works well when it's a one-on-one, but when you're a larger organization, you have hundreds or thousands of subcontractors, it can be really tough to do that. You can ask for a SPURS score and some questions to validate it, which is kind of the approach that DoD is taking right now. Or you can learn from DoD and all of the issues that they've been having, and you start actually having third parties do a review of their cybersecurity programs. So in 2019, DoD learned just how bad things were. So the NDIA, the National Defense Industry Association, conducted a survey of their members. So this was not DoD going out and doing things. NDIA conducted their own survey, and nearly half of all contractors had not implemented 800-171, despite the fact that it had gone into effect in 2016 and it was published in 2016, came into effect in 2017. 2 years later, nearly half contractors had not implemented. In fact, over 40% of contractors hadn't even read the DFAR 7012 clause that was the basis for it. Sarah Brin, at the same time, one of the C3PAOs and FedRAMP 3 PAOs, did a study or published a study of their own analyses for their clients. And out of the 50 companies that they assessed, not one company had properly implemented all 110 controls, and most companies had implemented less than 39% of the requirements. So DoD gets hit double whammy with both of those studies at the same time. In 2022, a little bit later, you have DIBCAC assessment results that show that people were going from 110-point score when DIBCAC would call them up and say, hey, we're going to do our 1 week audit. All of a sudden, their score would change in SPURS to negative 203. And that happened. Like you can talk to the DIBCAC folks. It happened more often than you would want. So DoD said, okay, we've learned our lessons, and so they created this thing called CMMC, and that is that third-party validation of the fact that I can trust Jake with my stuff. So now not only do I ask Jake, hey, can I trust you, but I actually get something from Tony or from somebody else that says, yes, you can trust Jake. Now, whether Tony is in cahoots with him is another story, but that's different. So talk about another case study.
So I want to get to the case study, but I think, and for those of you that have not seen me speak before, this is where it goes off the rails a little bit. One thing that is really interesting about this topic is working primarily in the commercial space and dealing with folks that are either serving the government or serving a prime contractor. They don't give a shit about whether or not you understand CUI. They don't care about whether or not it's marked properly. They care about whether or not they can manage risk, right? And so that's why, as somebody that's not required directly through dealing with the DoD to get CMMC, is why a lot of folks are opting to do it, because it is much, much more effective to go fast if you're already certified. Now, one of the things that we see a lot, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the case study, but it's not enough to just certify an enclave, and that's what we see a lot of our customers doing right now. They want to move fast, they don't want to disrupt their business, they don't want to invest in the entire company becoming CMMC compliant, because while it's a really good baseline, nobody wants a federal banner on a commercial system, right? And so when we think about this, one of the things that I advocate heavily for is get your enclave where it makes sense. And if you're going to take an enclave approach, make sure that you have the right DLP or DSPM, which is our preferred method. We use Wiz on every CMMC client, and monitor your non-federal environment. Because if you're not monitoring that environment, you're just creating another risk. And so when we think about this and we think about actionable ways for you to advocate and have some self-awareness from all of our fun compliance talk today, move quickly, get your certification, and protect yourself from data leakage. That's your best way of going. That's a little bit of where we're going to here with this, and I don't know if you have any clarity there.
No, well, so that's the trust but verify, right? So you can write all the policies you want, and policies are wonderful. Like, don't get me wrong, you need them in many cases, but in order to know that data isn't sitting outside of the protected boundary, you need to do some kind of audit. The easiest audit is to do an electronic one, let the systems run for you instead of having to do them. I've done data audits for folks. One very large organization that many folks would know, I did a data audit for them. We were hired to do, we were looking for healthcare information, and we were told that we would need to interview, because they didn't want to use a tool, told that we would need to interview about 30 different people or teams. We wound up conducting over 100 interviews, because every time we asked, we talked to them about what they were doing, we would ask them, do you know anybody else who might be, that we should talk to? And every time we got not one, but usually 2 or 3 other people that we needed to go talk to. So it is much more pervasive. It is much harder to identify. If you have an automated tool, it makes life so much easier. And then again, when you're assessed, or when stuff hits the fan, and now opposing counsel is asking you, what have you done? You can say, I've been monitoring. I'm not just passively sitting back and hoping that my policies work. There's that validation piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, if you go into even a small business that's been around for more than 5 years, I guarantee you they do not know what the sprawl and exposure is of their data. No matter how good the IT team is, no matter how good the security team is, there's stuff that you don't know about. And so you have to go in there and validate, right? And that's actually a great segue into case study too. It's another client of ours that we had a really fun time. I'm pretty sure they're working with the DoD to make like men that can breathe through gills. This is my theory. But they have a much less sensitive practice with research laboratories. And what they wanted to determine is, hey, we need to get ahead of this. We need to get ready for the DoD requiring this for us. And so what we want to understand is, where do we implement it? Do we do it in a very specific way, or do we do the entire enterprise? Because we're a large multinational enterprise with research labs all over the place, and we don't want to deal with data leakage and things like that, so why don't we bring it all up to CMMC? And so we went through this with them. They had a great commercial cybersecurity practice, high trust authorized, everything that you would need out of a healthcare provider. The CUI, of course, was not tracked or managed, not centrally logged. The DoD did not mark anything they've given them to date. And so we didn't really have a good basis other than we knew which labs were handling DoD contracts. And so we went through the entire process and we presented to them a comprehensive evaluation. And let me tell you, getting the enterprise, the CMMC, would interfere with our operations, cost $20 million, and be completely unsustainable in 3 years. And so what they decided, because they couldn't determine where CMMC lived today, they created an enclave, what they call a hub. And that CMMC hub is what every researcher and every person that's involved with the DoD and now with NIH has to work. And it's that simple. They track outside of that environment for anything that alerts on data leakage, anything that could look like CUI, anything that could look like other sensitive types of federal data. And they tell everyone within the organization through mandated training, if you're going to work not just directly on this, but tangentially with the US government, whether it be DoD, whether it be NIH Genomics, you must work in this hub. It's going to be a different computer, it's going to be a different login, and if you work outside of this, you'll be sanctioned or fired. And that is how they manage the risk. And so when it comes to this, one, you have to walk away from here and go back to your organizations educated on what Jim's telling you. You have to have that level of expertise, but you also have to have that awareness that this is complicated and we cannot necessarily move at the speed of government, because half the reason government uses commercial vendors is to move faster than they can move. And so you have to have these type of conversations, you have to analyze it, because we have a few other customers that they've taken their entire organization to level 2. Because they're like, we exist to serve the US government, we don't want to deal with data leakage, we don't want to have problems, everything's going to be CMMC compliant. And so that is the big takeaway for me when we think about this. You gotta move at the speed of business. You gotta risk manage CMMC, and you gotta do it not only from an educated place, but from a self-aware place. Because if you're gonna go out and tout all of the CMMC specific things, you're gonna probably be ignored by your business.
The statistic that I use, so we get questions a lot about enclaves and whether they're the right thing for us to do. The general rule of thumb is if about 60% of your business is handling CUI, don't bother. Just jump and do the entire organization. If you've got less than that, because you're going to have training, you're going to have retraining, you're going to have to educate your staff about support, you have all these other issues that you're going to have to deal with, it is just more efficient to just elevate the entire organization. On the flip side, if you're less than that, maybe it's worth it, and that's a harder conversation. Once you're down in that like 20 or 30% range, then I think you're probably better off in an enclave. So just to give you some general rules of thumb, and obviously, like I keep saying, the devil's in the details, there's always exceptions to every rule, but that's kind of a good back of the envelope number. If you disagree.
I agree with that. My only piece that I would say that's an easy math solution here is if you go back to your basic CISP, how do you do a risk assessment? What's the cost of monitoring data leakage events versus what is the cost of getting the rest of the organization to CMMC? Yeah. And if you look at it like that, you can put it in front of anyone that you're trying to convince to spend the dollars to protect the organization. But to your point, I mean, if you're doing 60% with the DIB, that's a wasted exercise. You should get everything CMMC compliant.
Yep. I agree. So, with that, we'll open up to questions. We have about 6 minutes left. Any questions? I think we have a catch box somewhere. Hang on, we got
somebody coming.